Welcome, everyone, to this Sunday virtual class sponsored by the BYU Library Family History in Provo, Utah. Our class today will be update of Ancestry.com presented by James Tanner. James is a long-standing genealogist and teacher of family history, and we greatly appreciate his preparations and willingness to share his knowledge with us on this topic. So I'll turn the time over to you now, James.
Okay, we're going to talk today about an update of Ancestry.com for 2023. I'll go back quite a ways in time, meaning into 2022. This is based in part on the presentations that were done by Ancestry at RootsTech 2023 in Salt Lake City at the Salt Palace. And we were fortunate, some of us were fortunate enough to be there in person and get a lot of this information. So we'll get moving here. First of all, where this was all taking place was RootsTech, the RootsTech 2023. For the interest of everyone watching, the RootsTech was held to be both in person and online. And we presently have more than, we have thousands. I'm not going to give you a number off the top of my head, but there are thousands of videos that have been accumulated over the past few years as they've had the virtual RootsTech. And most of those are still available on the RootsTech website. So there's just a huge amount. If you go to the top of the screen that we're looking at when you go to basically to RootsTech, you may see a different screen now because it's evolving as the year goes on. But there's an on-demand part that's up at the top of the screen, and that's what we would be, where you would click, and then you will get access to all of those back presentations that are on there. Some of the presentations that were live at the time may be hosted on other websites or not available because of whatever restrictions that were placed on the original recordings. But there's just thousands of videos there, and it's extremely interesting. So we'll get moving along. Where you will find a lot of the information too is in what's called the virtual expo hall. And that's where those people who were sponsors of RootsTech had information. Of course, during the in-live conference, they were there physically and had booths and were talking to people, and it's a very good experience. And if you have an opportunity next year in 2024 to come to RootsTech, I would suggest you make plans and come in person because it's quite an experience. But meanwhile, all the information about the individual companies, such as you see down here from FamilySearch and Ancestry and MyHeritage and another company called Storied, are available. A lot of that information is available right here on the websites with the original presentations and the information that was passed out by those companies. This is the on-demand library, and it says there are more than 1,500 sessions and 185 topics in over 30 languages, and that's just for 2023. Actually, there's filters down the side of this. It says suggested filters way down in the left-hand corner, and the suggested filters allow you to choose which year or all the years, and that's where you get the huge number of videos that are all still available online. So what happened with Ancestry? Well, they had a number of live and main stage sessions, and I went through those and with a lot of detail and did some other research as to the kinds of changes. And also a lot of this also will be my own observations of changes. I think we get used to, in the past few years, not too long, but past 4 or 5 years, we've kind of got the idea that Ancestry is changing rather slowly. Well, if you've been on the program just lately, you'll find out that the interface that you probably have gotten used to over the years is now starting to evolve. And you're seeing new things that you haven't seen before, and you're seeing new ways of doing things from the way that you may have been used to. So there's some changes, and there's quite a bit of evolution in the program itself and what is being offered. First of all, Ancestry is now celebrating its 40th anniversary, 40 years of Ancestry. Now, Ancestry goes back to a publication, a paper magazine. Some of you probably still read those, but a paper magazine called Ancestry that was published in Utah, Salt Lake City, and was available back many years ago. And that evolved into a number of different they weren't online because online didn't particularly exist, but there were DVD-based databases that were created by Ancestry, and eventually the people, group of people bought the company, changed the company, went through growth, got changed. More people came in and bought the company, changed growth over the years until we have what Ancestry today. The main headquarters for Ancestry is south of Salt Lake City, north of where I live, in Lehi, Utah, and they have a rather large headquarters there. So basically, the last time we were had what we might call some things that were going on, and I'm going to jump way back in the past here just to get some perspective of how this is working. This is a blog post I wrote back for RootsTech 2012, and I made a number of predictions on that after watching what was happening with the different panelists and people who were speaking, particularly keynote speaker Tim Sullivan, who was the CEO of Ancestry.com at that time. And their company has grown considerably since 2012, which is, of course, about 11 years ago. But you'll see down here at the bottom, and I don't expect you to be able to read that all really well, but there were some predictions. First of all, my predictions and the predictions that were made at the time by those and that I kind of agreed with were handwriting recognition and discovering common ancestors through DNA and picking out the right ancestor with DNA, and then the reliability of the platform, meaning that we weren't having all of the problems that we were having with getting information back and forth from the websites that we had 10 years and plus ago, and having a more stable environment to work in when you were working online. These were things that weren't necessarily directly responsible. The genealogy companies weren't responsible for because it was part of the environment that we were working in. But the problems I also pointed out that needed solution was number one, was handwriting recognition. And then the second part of that was building the computational background to do the DNA testing. In other words, it's nice to have DNA tests, but do you have programs and mechanisms to analyze that data and put it into the family tree structure of the genealogy programs so that you can say, this person is your relative, this person is your second cousin or third cousin or fourth cousin or whatever. And then the other was that I saw that was making the websites more transparent. What I meant by transparent and what their discussion was about was making it so that you could actually use the program. In other words, it had to be something that was understandable and useful to someone who came on who was not a genetic scientist who understood DNA and still could get some information out of it. In addition to that, ways of making the records more available so that when you went to look at a record, you weren't just totally out and wondering what world am I looking at. And the last one was getting the technology in place to allow genealogists to do their work. So we really, a lot of us spend a considerable amount of time daily on our computers and going through and doing the kinds of things that we do, the kinds of things that I do, which includes preparing these classes, preparing webinars, making videos, doing basic genealogical research, answering questions from people around the world and things like that. Now, all that was something that I could see was possible, but I was in the position of saying, well, when is that going to happen? So first of all, that was back in 2012. And so we're going to give you a little bit of, here's a review of what I just said. They went, for example, with memories. There was a program called Dropbox, which is still around, that allowed you to transfer data between computers, meaning you could drop a file, like a Word file, into Dropbox, and someone else who was at the other end could drag that out and have a copy of that Word file, which, by the way, was quite innovative in the way that it was handled. And now it's fairly common, and the large genealogy companies have all created ways to do that directly, everything from Microsoft to every other company has some process by which you can transfer data. Getting science out of the way of doing the work, that's still in process. That one hasn't been resolved. It was a development that had made some progress back in 2012. So now let's look at some of the things that have happened in the last year or so as a culmination of those particular projects that were being worked on even 10, 12, 15, 20 years ago. So now what we have is, back in 2022, Ancestry made an announcement that they were going to apply handwriting recognition and artificial intelligence to create a searchable index of the 1950 US Census. Now, there's a lot I can say about both because I have been carefully following the handwriting recognition developments, primarily once a year, and now this year was the first time, 2023 was the first time since before the pandemic, that BYU, Brigham Young University, held its Family History Technology Conference. They called it a workshop this year. So it was a BYU Family History Library, Family History Technology Workshop. And the technology workshop was held on the BYU campus usually on the Monday or the Tuesday before RootsTech. So depending on the date, but primarily on a Monday. And so what happens is that people come from, and by the way, this is the promotional items on the BYU conference are extremely, let's call it specialized. In other words, if you know that the conference is going to be held because you are interested enough to know that, just off Netflix, and you begin looking online a few months in advance, you just may come up with a release somewhere on the BYU Family History Technology website. They're part of the computer classes and computer department at Brigham Young University. And then eventually sometime during the year, they'll announce the date, and then later we'll ask for contributions, papers, and then they'll post it all. It's not going to be broadcast everywhere in the world like it is for RootsTech, because it's not intended to be the kind of a conference. It's focused, just absolutely focused on 5 and 10 minute and 15-minute presentations. So you're getting a whole bunch of different people in one day talking about their products and their developments, but they're all limited to just a few minutes. And so basically the rest of the time is spent talking to the people and trying to get more information and understanding what they're trying to do. And the conference here probably had a couple of hundred people, maybe 150 people at it this year. And it was an amazing. And the thing that's amazing is that they're talking directly about handwriting recognition and have been for years. And now Ancestry, who was at the conference, was in the position of having announced and having executed the fact that they were going to make a searchable index of the 1950 census. So this was something that had been hinted at for years. And so the question was, how was it going to work and how well would it work? So the Ancestry team began the process of applying their program, their developed handwriting recognition and artificial intelligence program to the 1950 census on January 27th, 2022. Here's the interesting thing that came out of that. In the 1940 US Census, which came out in 2012, took 9 months of preparation before the initial indexes began to come out, and they came out much slower than, over a period of time after that. So it was almost a year after the 2012 census, 1940 census has come out before it was generally available to be searched. In other words, you could have access to the images, but to have some way to search the images rather than just page by page or knowing where you were going to look didn't exist, and it took them 9 months. Now you'll see on the right-hand side what happened with the 1950 U.S. Census, and in 2022 took 9 days. It went from 9 months to 9 days. They had a complete index of the millions of names in the U.S. Census in 9 days. Now, was it all correct? Well, the answer was that Ancestry got together with Family Search as a partnership, and so Ancestry provided the handwriting recognition indexing of the 1950 census, and then they turned it over to volunteers from Family Search who went through and reviewed the indexing. In other words, you'd see a comparison of what the handwriting recognition said was the entry and the actual entry from the digital copy of the 1950 census side by side. And then you would make, as you were doing the review, you would make a value judgment and say, this is correct or it's not correct. And then there was a way within the review process to do that. Now, that process of the underlying process of continued review of the handwriting recognition is what's going on today. There is, if you go on the FamilySearch.org website, a place to do your indexing. It's still in existence, it's still there. But if you go to what's called Get Involved, which is a possibility on that particular census, on the Family Search program, then you can elect to continue to review records in a variety of languages as they're being artificially, through handwriting recognition and artificial intelligence being made into an index. So this is the kind of, the indexing has sort of evolved from clearly being a manual process into the review of a automatic process. The review, by the way, process takes tremendously less time for most of the entries than it did when you were doing indexing. So it's speeded up completely. So the effect of that was that we had an index, a searchable index, eventually for all the companies have now come around to having their indexes for the 1950 census. But we do have a searchable index, and I quite frankly have to, well, if you want an opinion right now, the best index is still the one that's sitting on Ancestry.com. So the other ones will become as equally as, well, maybe not, but they will become searchable even as time goes on now. So this is called name review, and you can do it and then get your statistics of how many names you've corrected and how many countries you've helped. And they're doing this in all the languages. So what does this mean? Let me just kind of specify what this means. It means that The handwritten records that are sitting in parish registers from anything before 1880 and even up into the 1900s, and anything on any of the other kinds of records out there, from census records to every place. And we're talking every country eventually will be targeted with these records. Now, where these records are coming, for sort of give a side note here, I realize we're talking primarily today about ancestry, but it's important to note that that same technology kind of thing is being used by Family Search, and their goal has been targeted primarily on Italian and Spanish-speaking, Spanish language records from Central South America. So basically, you've got records that have previously not been indexed at all. There's no index to an index that is quite a bit better than it was originally, which was nothing. So now, now we have some information that comes to Ancestry about the 1950 census and how it works. Now, you may think, if you're as old as I am, which hopefully not all of you are, but if you're around long enough to even have been born in 1950, your name is in the census, and your family, wherever you were in America, in the United States of America in 1950, you show up in the 1950 census. Now, so that means, and it's pretty obvious that I'm old enough to have been in the 1950 census. But what does that mean to genealogy and the research that we're doing in genealogy? Well, it gives us some information that seems to be, in a case you've done your research and you've started any kind of genealogical effort, and you have even 2 or 3 generations, maybe 4 generations in some families, or all your families going back, you may think, well, what good is the 1950 census? Because I've already gone through all that. Well, here's the problem that you perhaps are not quite focusing on, is that having the 1950 census means that we have that much closer information in time. That was the same thing that happened with the 1940 census and the 1930 censuses, because when those became available, they gave us big blocks of information about who was living here in the United States and where our ancestors may have been. And a lot of the issues and problems that we find in genealogy is getting started correctly, and answering questions about family members who seem to be hard to find. Giving the information of the 1950 census gives us another level of information that we can use to move backwards. And perhaps we don't know that that's good. But if you're just starting out, then it's the best thing that could have happened, because in this case, instead of starting to need looking at people who were born in the early 1800s, you've moved up over the last 20 years to people who were born in the 1940s and 1950s, and in families. And so now you can go, people who are 1950 show up in the census, and you can see the families. And then if you know that you were born in 1955 or 60, that you can trace your family back very quickly and very easily backwards. And that's what's happening here. And this is a great benefit to a lot of people and who are just getting started in the program. So here we are. This is the census search, and you can go through here. This is one, understand that the census copy was provided by the National Archives. And so this is part, there's a way to get into this. Actually, the census is on the National Archives, but this searchable part of it is on Ancestry. So I would suggest you may want to get around and see where all your relatives were and what they were doing and how they were living. Now, I use this as part of my presentation, this whole process here, that basically came from the increase in what I did for these examples was based completely on the concept that there had been a great leaps in handwriting recognition, that a lot of the documents were now indexed, and that I could do this. So what I did for my presentation at RootsTech was a live class and 6 videos. Each one of the 6 videos and the live class researched different individual families, starting with an individual, back through history to the enslaved person. The reason for doing this was to illustrate the movement of the previously enslaved families from the South to all parts of the United States in the West and North and Northeast, beginning in 1915 to 1970. The number of people who were moving out of the South at that time is estimated to be around 6 million people. So 6 million African-American people left the South, traveled north, and basically emigrated, moving from the place of their origin to a new place. And finding those people and a lot of other people who were moving around in the country raises issues that are common with all issues of immigration. It's the same procedure that you use to find an African-American family who moves from Alabama and ends up in Chicago, as it is when you find a person who was living in Germany who comes to the United States, or from England, or from wherever country in Europe, Scandinavia, or whatever. The immigration issue is always the same. And so all the same questions have to be answered. The same methodology applies to whether I'm looking for a Scandinavian immigrant or I'm looking for a American who left the South and went north. There's all the same challenges and issues. The key to all this was the 1950 census. And what I did was, of course, I kind of made it so that I was controlled what I did, so I'd have good examples, is I chose a person out of, in the 1950 census, who said that they were born in one of the southern states, and then tracked that person back through all the census records primarily to the first person who was actually born as an enslaved person in the South. And usually it was 2 or 3 and sometimes 4 generations of people back to someone who was born before 1867, 68, 69, 70. So those are the kinds of things that could be done. This was enabled by Ancestry being able to have given me a searchable copy of the 1950 census to do this. And that's exactly the kinds of things that I could not have done. I could not have done it all in some cases because they just would never have worked. But it was enabled, or it was possible to do by time. And I have to admit that I bit off a lot more than I can chew with this migration presentation. By the way, all these videos, the 6-part series, are on RootsTech, and I have a handout that you can download that's 158 pages, and it has 11 pages of bibliography references for all the information. It turns out to be a project that took me 2 or 3 months of a lot of work, of daily work on this. So now we're talking about, and change kind of the subject here, but this is all kind of related because there is an incentive now to get even more records. Part of the problem of acquisition of the records by a large organization like Ancestry, or any of the others for that matter, is that, yes, you could go out and digitize all these records, but then what do you do with all the digital copies? In order to make them usable, particularly in the context of Ancestry.com, they need to be indexed. Well, now, all of a sudden, not all of a sudden after many years, but now, and it's as kind of something that happened just seemingly over the last year or so, but actually took many, many, many years before that. But is that now even Ancestry can acquire billions of records and index them in a way that makes them tremendously more useful. And so during 2022, Ancestry basically indicated that they had added 5.2 billion new historical records during 2022. But they also announced that during 2023, they would be adding another 15 billion new historical records. Now, granted, they count the records, and that, however they count them is what it is, but regardless of the way they count, that's an awful lot of records. Well, if we look at the Ancestry card catalog to see what kind of records are coming out that are new, and look at the large collections that are coming out, we'll see that there's a lot of records, different kinds of records, but the big numbers, as you look down towards the bottom of the pages, are basically files that are coming into their other website, which another one of their websites called newspapers.com. Now, newspapers.com is a separate subscription website from Ancestry. So even if you have the Ancestry World Complete Data, whatever, you have to pay an extra amount to get newspapers.com. And so, then the two programs work together, because if you've done any searching on Ancestry, you'll realize that a lot of times you'll see a record come up that says that there's a newspaper article about your ancestor, your relative. And because of that, you need to look at it in order to see the actual record. You'd have to have a newspapers.com subscription. So it works obviously to Ancestry's advantage, but it also works to the advantage of anyone who understands and realizes how much value there is in the newspapers. Basically, when I do newspapers.com, I make the last time we did this was we got a free 1-month subscription to newspapers.com. My wife and I spent practically the whole month just copying out newspapers for all of the people we could find, and then spent many, many months of time attaching all those as sources to people, and processing all of the information that was in all those records. So this is something that you have to make a decision as to if it's enough of your benefit to subscribe to this, to newspapers.com as a separate program to ancestry.com. Okay, and I've had an Ancestry subscription for as long as almost since the day it began. So it's not something that I just live with. It's part of like the paying for the lights and power and water and things in my house. It's just part of the utilities that I feel are necessary. So here's the newspapers.com, and they have, and this number goes up considerably, and I'm sure it's gone up significantly since the time of this, that I did this slide. But at the time I did this slide, it was 842 million pages of newspapers. And you can see the states that are more highly represented than others. And I think it's important that I also mention that this is not the only source for information from newspapers. There's a substantially large collection of newspapers from the Library of Congress that are free, and the Library of Congress records are not anything close to this number of pages here, but they are also completely searchable by page. And what Ancestry has added now is a complete, what's called complete page or complete page indexing. So they index everything. They don't just go through and search for names, they search for everything on the page. So you get every name of every person on the page, whether it's a genealogy reference like an obituary or whether it's an ad. a commercial advertisement. So but it does give you a complete way of searching for individuals that was not particularly available before. And now when you add the number of newspapers that are available, if you are interested in doing it, you can get a 7-day free trial. But on the other hand, I would suggest that you begin looking at newspapers, digital newspapers online that you can search for free. And when you realize the value, you may very well realize that newspapers.com is a good investment for you, or have 6 months or a 1-month subscription or whatever. Now, let's move into what happens with the DNA. Ancestry came on very strong with its promotions for DNA testing, and now has the largest consumer network. Now, there's a good thing and good news and bad news about this. Yes, a huge number of people have taken a DNA test from Ancestry, but the problem is, to some extent, is that not all of those people have family trees on Ancestry. So they took a DNA test, they didn't get a family tree, and so even if they are a DNA match, you may not be able to tell how those people are related. But what the technology is doing is that Ancestry is going beyond the simple saying, oh, you have all these matches and these are all the people you're related to. They're developing technology, and through different kinds of analysis of the data, including the amount of information that's now coming out in all their record matches, because they now have this huge volume of record hits that give you possible connections to various documents, including all these newspaper stories. So you're basically getting a lot of information that they can use and suggest. And so not only do you get more specific ethnicity estimates, so that you are more likely to have accurate information about where your family came from, but also you're able to give you more information about how you are connected to all these various people. And the development from Ancestry is through lines, which is here on this page from their genealogy program. And so that basically tells you something that's extremely helpful. So let's look at, first of all, the ethnicity estimates. If you got a DNA test a few years ago, and you've been watching your entries on Ancestry or any of the other companies, you realize that how and where they're telling you you're from has changed considerably, and is still changing. So as they get more and more data in the programs, as they're able to analyze that data with more people in their giant family tree programs, there are millions of family trees, they are able to tell you now with more specificity where you came from. Originally, when I did it, I would say things like, I have no idea where they got that, because I don't have as many ancestors from Sweden and Denmark as I do from England and northwestern Europe. But as I start to analyze my own particular, I can see how that could happen. In other words, their DNA testing and their places where this information comes from are these two places in Sweden and Denmark. Obviously, they're both in Denmark and not in Sweden, but Sweden and Denmark are the same country for many times going back in the past. So there's no, you need to understand that Norway, Sweden, and Denmark have all been in the same country, been in different countries. Sweden and Denmark have been the same country. Denmark and Norway have been the same country, so forth, back and forth. So talking about them as individual countries is kind of an artificial, because from the jurisdictional, the political standpoint, they have all been the same country at some point in time. But they've been able to come down and actually focus on the county in in Denmark, where my family primarily came from. So as this gets to more and more information, you find out more and more about the kinds of where your ancestors came from. And this is the new kind of development. And this was this came out a few months ago, and this is another thing from Ancestry that was tremendously different, and that is where you got your ethnicity from your sides of the family. So what part of the family did you get information from parent one, who would be your father, and parent two, who would be your mother or your father, whichever side it happens to come out on. And basically, you get to see the breakdown of how your parents were related, in a sense, because it'll show you the different ethnicity, and then your figures, your percentages from each of the countries. So you can see if you got more from parent one or from parent two, and you could see exactly how that happened. Now, this is happening within Ancestry, even though my parents and perhaps your parents did not and will never have a DNA test, because both my parents are deceased. And so there's no way for me to get their DNA tests. I could, and some of my siblings have had DNA tests, and a few of my children, and so that we're getting a little bit of information that way. But this basically gives us a starting point for DNA analysis and helps us in determining what kinds of information is available. So this is, and all I can say in more detail is to go on the website on Ancestry and start reading down through this. And there's quite a bit of information there to explain how this all works and what the details stand for. So now I can see how many DNA matches I have. So first of all, I have 15,000 DNA matches through my parent one line, which are from this case, it turns out that is my mother's line, because that's the Linton Morgan line. And then parent two, I have 19,000 matches through the Tanner line, which is my father's line. So this is, this is interesting because it actually separates it out. So we know, in a sense, we now have the two distinct branches. We know which group of people came and who's matching. And so if we have a DNA match that falls into one of the first categories, and the second category, parent one or parent two, we know that roughly speaking, we now know which side of the family they're on. And then we have some overlap, and the reason we have overlap is because my families, in a sense, have intermarried, and there are people I am descended from both sides, and they match both sides of the family. And this comes out quite a bit different how this impacts the DNA. So I'm connected to two communities. What that means is they have actually created a community that says that these people over in the United States came from this specific part of Denmark. And this basically people from central Arizona and other people, and they found ancestor stories, meaning information about, in a story format about individuals who were Southern Utah and Arizona settlers who came from Denmark. Now, if you didn't know that before, that gives you a good place a good head start on doing research. If in my case, it's not really surprising because I knew that, but it is nice to know that it's been confirmed by DNA testing. And this shows you where your family lives today. And if you look kind of around on that map, you'll see that they are sort of spread around the world a little bit. Now, there was another part of Ancestry that was developed, and it's called Story Scout. So they are actually finding out details of the stories by analyzing the information that they have in the databases and which are available to Ancestry, and how that has affected the lives of your ancestors. And you'll find out that a couple of my ancestors were suffragettes. They were people who were very much involved in, and well-known people who were involved in promoting the idea of voting for women. And then there's lots of other stories out there. And these are stories that it's not things that particularly you have compiled, but can be gleaned from all the information, the documents and the memories, the photographs that have been uploaded to Ancestry. And some of them are very, very interesting. And it gives you quite a broad perspective. And this is new stuff. I mean, these are things that have just started to be developed. Now, probably one of the ones, and I guess if you take it from one standpoint, is this through lines. And from one point, to tell me who my parents are doesn't really impact me a whole lot, because all it does is confirm the fact that, yes, those are my parents. But the question here is, this goes to grandparents, and then it goes to great-grandparents, and then it goes to great-great-grandparents. And what is good about this is that when you get this information, if you have the DNA testing and you have the family trees and you've been doing the research, it basically confirms the fact that you're on the right track, that you have the paper research that you've done over the years is accurate, that these people really were your ancestors, and you haven't gotten somehow off onto a line that wasn't correct. And the interesting thing about it is, and how this comes out, is how it is that you're related to some of these people, because there's different stories about who these people are and how you would be related to them. So this is kind of it's a comforting reinforcement of the fact that the research that you've been doing is substantiated by a scientific process that has some very, very well-tested scientific validity. And that does make it a lot easier to keep working. So now they're making, the one thing that they've done is to begin to connect around your family story. This, I think, works better in some families than others, but it is an interesting concept of focusing in on the family stories. And it may be something that attracts you and other people to doing more, being more involved with genealogy. So, for example, here, personal records such as your ancestors' passports, marriage certificates, other documents, they're collected and turned into family stories, giving you a fresh way to see who they were and how they lived. So rather than just having a pile of documents sitting in that you've loaded in, they then organize that and go through the records and put them in an order and create the stories, so that how you get an interpretation of that. And it's part of the program. So you're not paying extra for this. You'll get these Story Scout stories about your ancestors from the records that are there online, and not necessarily just your records, the ones you personally put up there, but the records that are online about those people from any of the relatives who have added the information to your family. So you're going to get a pretty complete history on some of your ancestors. And you have now another app on your phone. It's called StoryMaker Studio. And it's a way to create a slideshow collage from a media gallery that you've uploaded and create a story with pictures. And you can do that by tagging photos, adding dates, adding locations, and get all the information and create a story right on on your smartphone app. And obviously, when we're talking about this, you're going to take some time to get into it. So voice recording, it'll record your voice, it'll give you prompts, has an enhanced photo with photo tagging and voiceover written memos. And this is kind of the total of the kinds of things. And let me just go back here that begins to come out of doing all of this genealogical research, is turning it into something that makes that gives you the understanding and the ability to really get into all this information. And those of us who do a lot of research sometimes don't spend the time to put it all into a reasonable, organized fashion that is in the sense of tells a story. We have all the documents, but they're just documents until somebody comes along and turns it into some kind of a narrative that shows how these people lived. In the past, of course, there's been the surname books, the books that have been written about the family and the collections of stories of the histories of all the families. Well, this is our answer, Ancestry's answer to that challenge today, by giving us a way to do this with our smartphones. Without having to go to the expense of publishing a paper-bound paper book. Okay, well, thanks for watching.